I'm Arthur. In late June of 2014, a bulldozer drove into a long wall of sand in the desert and pushed until the wall broke. That wall of sand was an international border, the line between Iraq and Syria, and the men filming the bulldozer were announcing to the world that as far as they were concerned, the border no longer existed. Behind them stood something the modern world was not supposed to be able to produce. A terrorist organization with a flag, oil fields, tax collectors, courts, schools, license plates, and an army, ruling a territory larger than many countries over roughly 8 million human beings. Tonight I want to tell you the whole of that story, from its beginning in a Jordanian industrial town to the ash it ended in. Not the headlines you already remember, but the machinery underneath them and the people who paid for every hour that black flag flew. Settle in and stay with me. This one is long and it is dark and it deserves to be told properly. At its height, in the autumn of 2014, the group calling itself the Islamic State controlled something on the order of 41,000 square miles of Iraq and Syria. Depending on how you draw the shifting front lines, that is an area comparable to a mid-sized European country. Estimates of the population living under its rule run from 8 million people to as high as 11 million. It was, by most serious estimates, the richest terrorist organization that has ever existed. It sold oil. It collected taxes on salaries, on shops, on trucks at checkpoints, on cash withdrawals at the bank. It printed textbooks for children and death sentences for their parents, often on the same kind of paper. And here is the fact I want you to hold on to for the rest of the evening, because everything else in this story hangs from it. 4 years before that autumn, this organization was a hunted, broken remnant, so diminished that its two most senior leaders were cornered and killed together in a single raid on a single house. Most of the men who would later run the so-called caliphate were, at that moment, either in prison or in hiding. A decade has now passed since the worst of it, and you can already feel the forgetting set in. The children who watched those black flags on the news are adults who could not place Raqqa on a map. The story has collapsed, in the public memory, into a shorthand of orange jumpsuits and a few terrible video stills, which is precisely the fragment the organization itself would have chosen for us to keep, because the fragment is all menace and no autopsy. So the question of tonight is not simply what ISIS did, although we will face that honestly, because the title of this evening promises the darkest side, and I intend to keep that promise. The question is how a beaten remnant became a state, what that state actually was for the people trapped inside it, and what it cost the world to tear it back down. The answer begins long before the bulldozer and the berm, in a gray industrial city in Jordan, with a young man nobody expected anything from. Zarqa is a working city northeast of Amman, a place of factories, garages, and crowded districts that grew faster than anyone planned. In October of 1966, a boy named Ahmed Fadil al-Khalila was born there, into a large family without money or connections. The world would come to know him by the name he took from his hometown, Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, the man from Zarqa. There was nothing in his youth that suggested history would remember him. He dropped out of school, he drank, he fought, and he drifted into petty crime, and by his early 20s he had seen the inside of a Jordanian jail. The men who knew him then described muscle and temper, not ideas. The ideas came later, and they came the way they often do, through a door opened by a war. At the end of the 1980s, Zarqawi traveled to Afghanistan, arriving as the Soviet war there was winding down. He had missed most of the fighting, but he found the world that fighting had created, a brotherhood of foreign volunteers, preachers, and veterans, convinced they had just bled an empire to death. Back in Jordan in the 90s, he was arrested and spent years in prison for involvement in a plot against the state. And it was there, in prison, that the Mosul finally met its mind, because sharing his confinement was one of the most influential jihadist theorists alive, a scholar named Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi. The older man supplied the doctrine. The younger man supplied something the doctrine had rarely had before, a street enforcer's understanding of fear. Fellow prisoners from those years describe a strange division of power. Maqdisi held the ideas, but it was Zarqawi who ran the cell block, deciding who could speak to whom, punishing the disloyal, nursing the sick with his own hands, and commanding a devotion that unsettled the guards. Prison did not correct him. It concentrated him, and when an amnesty released him in 1999, he came out with a following, a creed, and a purpose, and within months he had made his way back to Afghanistan. There, around 1999, he was given something that mattered enormously, his own training camp near the western city of Herat. It is worth pausing on this, because it tells you what he was and what he was not. He was not at this point a member of al-Qaeda. He ran his own small network with his own harsher creed, and even hardened men in that world found his absolutism unsettling. Then came the American invasion of Afghanistan, and Zarqawi, like many others, slipped away. By 2002, he had made his way toward Iraq, moving through its Kurdish north, where a militant enclave gave men like him shelter in the mountains. And here history hands us one of its bitterest ironies. In February of 2003, the American Secretary of State, Colin Powell, stood before the United Nations Security Council to make the case for invading Iraq, and in that speech he named Abu Musab al-Zarqawi repeatedly, presenting him as the living link between Saddam Hussein and al-Qaeda. The claimed partnership between the dictator and the jihadist was never substantiated, and Powell himself came to regret the speech. But the broadcast did something no recruiting pamphlet could have done. It introduced an obscure Jordanian ex-convict to the entire world as America's named enemy. A month later, the United States and its allies invaded Iraq, shattered its army, dissolved its state, and disbanded its civil service, sending hundreds of thousands of trained soldiers and officers home humiliated, armed, and unemployed. Whatever else that spring accomplished, it handed Abu Musab al-Zarqawi the war he had been waiting for his entire life, and an officer class to fight it with. What he built in Iraq was called Tawheed wal Jihad at first, and its signature was visible within months. In August of 2003, a truck bomb tore through the United Nations headquarters in Baghdad, killing the head of the mission and many of his staff. That same month, a massive car bomb outside one of Shia Islam's holiest shrines in the city of Najaf killed a revered Ayatollah and scores of worshippers. Look at those two targets, because they are the whole strategy in miniature. Not the occupying army, but the institutions that might stabilize the country, and the religious community whose rage, once ignited, would burn the country down. American officials would eventually link Zarqawi's network to more than 700 killings in Iraq, most of them by bombing, and the overwhelming majority of the dead were Iraqi civilians. By 2004, his center of gravity was Fallujah, the restive city west of Baghdad that had become a no-go zone for the occupation, filling with insurgent factions, weapons workshops, and his own foreign volunteers. It took two of the bloodiest battles of the entire war, the second of them in November of that year, for American forces to take the city back, house by house. Zarqawi himself was long gone by then. The pattern of his career and of the organization he seeded was already visible. The leaders escape, the city pays. In October of 2004, Zarqawi did something that made him a global name. He pledged allegiance to Osama bin Laden, and his network became known as al-Qaeda in Iraq. On paper, he was now a franchise of the world's most famous terrorist brand. In practice, the relationship was poisoned almost from the start, because Zarqawi's methods disturbed even al-Qaeda. He beheaded bound hostages on camera and released the recordings to the internet, a practice that began in earnest in 2004 with an American civilian named Nicholas Berg, and the Arabic press took to calling Zarqawi the Sheikh of the Slaughterers. He bombed Shia mosques, markets, and funerals deliberately, seeking not victory over the Americans, but civil war among Iraqis. Watch how deliberate the design was. Kill Shia civilians until Shia militias retaliate against Sunni civilians. Then present your own killers to the terrified Sunni community as its only shield. It is a machine for manufacturing your own necessity, and it worked well enough that al-Qaeda's second-in-command wrote to him, in a letter later made public, warning that the slaughter of Shia civilians and the filmed butchery were costing the movement the hearts of ordinary Muslims. Zarqawi's answer was more of both. In November of 2005, his suicide bombers walked into 3 hotels in Amman, in his home country of Jordan. Around 60 people died, many of them guests at a wedding. The bride and groom each lost a parent, and Jordan, which had produced him, turned on him almost overnight. Then, in February of 2006, came the bomb that achieved his life's ambition. The golden-domed al-Askari shrine in Samarra, one of the most sacred sites of Shia Islam, was blown apart in an attack widely attributed to his organization. No group ever formally claimed it, but it hardly mattered. Iraq's simmering sectarian violence exploded into open civil war, with death squads, reprisal killings, and neighborhoods cleansed street by street, and tens of thousands of Iraqis would die in the years that followed. Zarqawi did not live to see most of it. On the 7th of June, 2006, American aircraft dropped 2 500-pound bombs on a safe house northeast of Baghdad where he was meeting his spiritual advisor. He survived just long enough for the soldiers who reached the rubble to watch him die. The man was gone. But listen to what he left behind, because this is the part that matters for our story. He left a method, the deliberate use of atrocity as a recruiting tool and sectarian war as a strategy. He left a network of Iraqi and foreign fighters welded together in his image. And within months, that network renamed itself, and the new name contained a promise and a warning that almost nobody took seriously. They called themselves the Islamic State of Iraq, not a movement, a state. For years, that name read like delusion. We are about to see how it stopped being one. In the far south of Iraq, near the port city of Qasr, the American military built its largest detention facility of the war and named it Camp Bucca. Over the years of the occupation, tens of thousands of Iraqi men passed through its gates. Some were hardened insurgents, many others were swept up in raids on thin suspicion, held for months among men far more dangerous than themselves. By the end of this chapter, you will understand why analysts would later give Camp Bucca a bitter nickname, the University. Because inside that wire, something was assembled that the war outside could never have assembled on its own. Consider what a detention camp offers a movement like Zarqawi's. It gathers committed jihadists, former officers of Saddam Hussein's disbanded army, and angry, rudderless young men, and it concentrates them in one place with nothing but time. The guards, without meaning to, had solved the recruiters' hardest problems: vetting, introductions, and privacy. In February of 2004, American forces near Fallujah arrested a quiet, 32-year-old religious scholar named Ibrahim Awad al-Badri. He had been born near Samarra in 1971 into a pious family that claimed descent from the Prophet, and the people who knew him young remembered two things about him. He was so withdrawn and studious that relatives called him the believer, and he was a gifted soccer player, the star of his local mosque club, a detail that sits very strangely against everything that follows. He was, at the time of his arrest, a doctoral student of Quranic studies in Baghdad, nearsighted, unremarkable, polite to his captors. He spent roughly 10 months in American custody, much of it in Abu Ghraib prison, with a final stretch at Camp Bucca, where fellow detainees remembered him leading prayers, teaching, and settling disputes among prisoners, a mediator trusted by every faction. The review board classified him as a low-level threat, and in December of 2004, he was released. The world would meet him again a decade later, under the name Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, standing in a pulpit in Mosul, declaring himself the ruler of all Muslims everywhere. He was not the only one. When researchers later traced the leadership of the Islamic State, the same detail kept surfacing with eerie regularity. The man who would serve as Baghdadi's deputy had been in Bucca. The chief spokesman had been in Bucca. The former Iraqi army colonel who would later mastermind the group's expansion into Syria had been in Bucca. The military commander who would plan the seizure of Mosul had been in Bucca, and so had the man who would eventually succeed Baghdadi as leader. Former detainees described how the camp's sections became classrooms, with religious instruction on one side and, quietly, the exchange of military knowledge on the other. Men wrote each other's names and phone numbers on the elastic of their underwear so the connections would survive the searches on release day. What I keep coming back to is the arithmetic of it. The prison was meant to subtract fighters from the war, and instead it multiplied them. Meanwhile, outside the wire, the organization those men belonged to was being beaten nearly to death. The turning force was not only American. Beginning around 2006, the Sunni tribes of western Iraq, exhausted by the Islamic State of Iraq's cruelty, its taxes, its murders of sheiks and policemen, rose against it in a movement known as the Awakening. Tribal fighters who knew every road and every family joined with the American troop surge, and together they tore the insurgency's sanctuaries apart. The group answered the awakening the only way it knew. Tribal leaders who had turned against it were assassinated by the hundreds in the years that followed, bombed at funerals, shot at checkpoints, blown up in their receiving rooms, a methodical liquidation of exactly the men who had beaten it. The message to the tribes was patient and unmistakable. The Americans will leave, we will still be here, and we keep lists. Still, by 2010, the Islamic State of Iraq was a shadow. Its cells were broken, its finances choked, its leaders hunted from safe house to safe house. In April of that year, the end seemed to arrive. Its two most senior figures, the group's emir and al-Zarqawi's old war minister, were killed together when Iraqi and American forces stormed the house where they were hiding near Tikrit. A few weeks later, in May of 2010, the surviving leadership chose a successor. They chose the quiet scholar from the camps, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Intelligence services barely updated their files. A broken group had handed its throne to an academic, and it ranked among the least urgent problems in the Middle East. It is one of the costliest misjudgments of the century so far. Baghdadi inherited a skeleton, but it was a skeleton with a spine of former Ba'athist officers, men trained in intelligence work, logistics, and organized brutality under Saddam Hussein, now fused with religious zealotry into something new. The most consequential of them was a former colonel from Saddam's air defense intelligence apparatus, known in the movement as Haji Bakr. When his papers were captured years later and published by German journalists, they revealed the mind of a secret policeman, not a preacher. Organizational charts, surveillance networks, files on who could be blackmailed and how. Men like him had spent their careers building a state of informers. Now they would build another one, with God's name on the letterhead. Patiently, invisibly, they rebuilt. Assassinations removed informants and rival commanders. Extortion of businesses in Mosul, running quietly underneath the government's nose for years, rebuilt the treasury. And then, beginning in July of 2012, the group launched a campaign it named with unusual honesty, Breaking the Walls. For a year, its car bombs and assault teams struck prison after prison across Iraq. The campaign reached its climax in July of 2013 with a coordinated night assault on 2 prisons at once, including Abu Ghraib itself. Around 500 prisoners escaped that night, many of them veteran fighters and mid-level commanders, and they flowed back into the organization like blood into a body. The university behind the wire had graduated its class. All that was missing was a war worthy of them, and just across the western border, one had already begun. In March of 2011, in the Syrian city of Daraa, schoolboys were arrested for painting anti-government graffiti on a wall, and a country's patience snapped. The protests that began that spring were met by the government of Bashar al-Assad with gunfire, then tanks, then artillery. By the following year, Syria was not a protest movement anymore. It was a civil war consuming an entire nation. For the rebuilt Islamic State of Iraq, watching from across the border, the Syrian catastrophe was an open door. Chaos was their native climate. In late 2011, Baghdadi sent a small group of operatives into Syria under a trusted commander named Abu Musab al-Jolani, with money, men, and instructions to build a front there. Haji Bakr, the old intelligence colonel, moved into northern Syria himself around the end of 2012 and set about applying his trade. His captured papers show the method in cold detail. Open a missionary office in a town, use it to recruit informants, map every family, every feud, every secret worth owning, and then, when the moment came, the takeover would already be complete before a shot was fired. While the world saw fanatics, the machine underneath was running the oldest playbook of the police state. The front Baghdadi had seeded took the name Jabhat al-Nusra, and it grew quickly into one of the most effective rebel forces in the war. Too effective in a sense, and too independent. Because in April of 2013, Baghdadi went on record with an announcement that stunned the movement. He declared that Nusra was, and always had been, merely an extension of his own organization, that the two were now merged, and that the merged entity would be called the Islamic State in Iraq and al-Sham. The acronym the world would learn to dread, ISIS, dates from that announcement. Jolani refused the merger publicly and appealed over Baghdadi's head to al-Qaeda's global leader, Ayman al-Zawahiri. Zawahiri ruled against Baghdadi and ordered ISIS to withdraw to Iraq. Baghdadi's reply was, in effect, that he answered to God, not to Zawahiri. In February of 2014, al-Qaeda formally disavowed ISIS altogether, declaring it was not a branch of their organization and bore no responsibility for its actions. Sit with that for a moment. The network that had carried out the September 11th attacks looked at this group and publicly washed its hands of it. Within the jihadist world, this was not a demotion. To the most extreme men in that world, it read as an advertisement. Foreign volunteers began choosing ISIS over al-Qaeda precisely because it was harsher, bolder, and less apologetic. They came in through Turkey's long southern border, along smuggling routes so well trodden that the towns on the way developed an entire service economy of safe houses and guides. And while other rebel groups bled themselves fighting the Syrian army, ISIS did something colder. It largely turned its guns on the rebels themselves, seizing the territory they had already liberated, absorbing their weapons, and executing their commanders. By January of 2014, the other rebel factions had had enough, and a broad coalition of them turned on ISIS across northern Syria in open warfare. The campaign cost ISIS its positions in the northwest, and it cost the group Haji Bakr himself, killed in a firefight that winter. But the strategic result was the opposite of a defeat. ISIS abandoned the crowded, contested northwest and concentrated its strength downriver, in the east, around the one prize it refused to release. That prize was a provincial capital on the Euphrates River, a city of a few 100,000 people named Raqqa, and by January of 2014 ISIS held it completely, the first major city anywhere to fall entirely under its rule. It declared the city the capital of its emirate. Black flags went up over the government buildings. Public executions began in the central squares, and the bodies were left on display as instruction. In Raqqa, the group rehearsed everything it would soon perform on a vastly larger stage. Religious police patrolled the streets, enforcing dress codes and prayer times. Churches were seized, their crosses torn down and replaced with the black flag. And human rights investigators documented bodies displayed in the city's main roundabout, some of them crucified after execution as a public exhibit. Dissent was managed with a simplicity that admitted no appeal, and the city learned, block by block, what the phrase Islamic State actually meant when it arrived at your door. It is worth remembering, whenever this story tempts you to think of its victims in categories, that the first and largest category was simply Muslims who did not obey, local imams who refused to preach the new line, doctors who treated the wrong patients, teenagers who mocked the fighters, women who walked wrong, men who sold cigarettes. The overwhelming majority of the people this organization killed across its entire existence were fellow Muslims, and Raqqa learned that before anyone else did. Western intelligence agencies watched all of this and mostly filed it under the Syrian war, one horror among many. But the decisive blindness was in Baghdad. Iraq's government had spent the years since the American withdrawal alienating its Sunni provinces, purging Sunni politicians on terrorism charges, and letting the army it inherited rot into a patronage machine. Through 2012 and 2013, Sunni Iraqis had mounted a vast, largely peaceful protest movement, camps and marches across the western provinces, demanding an end to arbitrary arrests and collective punishment. The answer came in April of 2013 when security forces stormed a protest camp at Hawija and dozens of demonstrators were killed. To a community already convinced the state saw them as enemies, the message landed with terrible clarity, and the men with the black flags were listening. The proof of how dry the kindling had become arrived at the very start of 2014, months before the world was paying attention. In January, ISIS fighters and allied tribesmen seized Fallujah, and the government could not take it back. An organization that 4 years earlier could barely hold a safe house now held a famous Iraqi city, 40 miles from Baghdad. and held it for month after month while the army shelled its own country's neighborhoods. Then, in early June of 2014, columns of pickup trucks began moving through the desert toward Iraq's second largest city. There were, by most estimates, somewhere between 800 and 1,500 fighters in the assault force. What they were about to do in 10 days would redraw the map of the Middle East, and almost nobody in power saw it coming. On paper, Mosul was defended by a garrison of some 30,000 soldiers and tens of thousands of federal police. On paper. In reality, the Iraqi army of 2014 was rotten with a practice known as ghost soldiers, men who existed only on the payroll, their salaries split between deserters and the officers who covered for them. Units that reported 1,000 men could field a few hundred, poorly supplied, badly led, and unpaid for months. The assault began in the first days of June, and for a brief moment it looked like just another raid. Then, on the 10th of June 2014, the defense of Iraq's second city simply dissolved. Soldiers stripped off their uniforms in the street and walked away. Generals fled by helicopter, and columns of armored vehicles, bought with billions of American dollars, were abandoned with their engines running. A force of perhaps 1,500 men had taken a city of well over 1.5 million people in less than a week. An estimated 500,000 civilians fled in those first days, clogging the roads north and east toward Kurdish territory. Those who stayed, or could not leave, woke to black flags over every government building. The first days of the occupation were, by design, quiet. The fighters directed traffic, reopened bakeries, and told the population they had come to lift the government's checkpoints and humiliations, and some war-weary residents at first believed them. Wanted men from the police and army were offered repentance cards, a signature and a fingerprint in exchange for their lives. The lists being compiled from those cards would be used, in the months that followed, to hunt down and execute the very men who had signed them. The loot was staggering. From Mosul's banks and from other branches seized across northern Iraq, the group took hundreds of millions of dollars in cash, with American officials eventually estimating at least $500 million. From the Army's abandoned depots, it took artillery, ammunition stockpiles, and armored vehicles by the thousand, including, by the Iraqi government's own later accounting, well over 2,000 American-supplied Humvees lost in Mosul alone. In a single week, a terrorist group had acquired the arsenal of a mid-sized state and the treasury to run it. Then the columns rolled south, toward Tikrit, and the world learned what the new masters of northern Iraq intended to do with prisoners. Near Tikrit stood an air base the Americans had called Camp Bucca, where thousands of young Iraqi Air Force cadets were stationed, most of them unarmed recruits in training. As the front collapsed, their commanders told them to change into civilian clothes and make their own way home. They walked out onto the open road, and ISIS was waiting for them. The fighters sorted the captured young men by religion, Sunni to one side, Shia to the other. Then, on the 12th of June, they took the Shia cadets in groups to ditches, to the riverbank, and to the grounds of a former palace, and they shot them hour after hour, filming as they worked. The most careful counts placed the number of murdered at around 1,700. It stands as the second deadliest terrorist attack in recorded history, behind only September 11th, and outside Iraq it is barely remembered at all. The mass graves were still being opened the following year after Tikrit was retaken, and mothers were still identifying sons by the contents of their pockets. I said at the start of tonight that we would face the darkest side of this organization honestly. Bucca is where the pattern locks in, and I want you to see its logic clearly. The massacre was filmed and published deliberately because terror was not a byproduct of their war. It was a weapon of it, engineered to make the next garrison run rather than fight, and the garrisons did run. Meanwhile, the map kept moving. Tikrit had fallen on the 11th of June. Within days, the group and its allies held a corridor of cities and towns running down the Tigris toward Baghdad, and it was in those same days that the bulldozer we began the evening with broke the border berm, while the group's media arm declared the end of the colonial map of the Middle East. For a few weeks that June, serious people in serious capitals asked, out loud, whether Baghdad itself was about to fall, and behind them a whole region recalculated. Iran rushed advisors and weapons to the government it could not afford to lose. Jordan and Saudi Arabia stared at their long desert borders. Volunteers, meanwhile, were streaming toward a winning flag, and Iraq's highest Shia religious authority issued a call to arms that sent tens of thousands of young men rushing into hastily formed militias to defend the capital. Then, 2.5 weeks after Mosul fell, on the 29th of June, 2014, the group's spokesman released an audio message. The Islamic State of Iraq and al-Sham was dissolving its old name, he announced, because it was no longer merely a state in Iraq and Syria. It was now the caliphate, the Islamic State, a claim of religious authority over every Muslim on earth, and its caliph was Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. Even by the standards of the movement it came from, the claim was staggering. Al-Qaeda had always spoken of the caliphate as a distant aspiration, a horizon to justify the struggle, not an address with a government attached. Baghdadi's organization had simply declared the horizon reached and dared every rival cleric and militant on earth to say otherwise. Many did say otherwise, loudly, and it did not matter, because the recruits were not reading the refutations. Days later, in the first week of July, Baghdadi did something the leader of al-Qaeda had never dared. He appeared in public, in daylight, on camera. Dressed in black, he climbed the pulpit of the great al-Nuri Mosque in Mosul, the mosque whose leaning minaret had watched over the city for more than 8 centuries, and he preached a Friday sermon as Caliph, commander of the faithful. The theater was precise. The obscure scholar from Camp Bucca now claimed a title last held, in any meaningful sense, generations before, and he claimed it standing in a conquered city of over 1 million people. Across the world, in London and Paris and Tunis and Sydney, young men and women watched that sermon on their phones, and by the tens of thousands they began to pack. Before we reach the mountain that gives this chapter its name, we need to stand in Mosul for one more moment, because what happened to that city's oldest communities in July of 2014 was a rehearsal for what came in August. Mosul and the plains around it had been home to Christians since the early centuries of the faith. Within weeks of the takeover, their houses began to be marked. A single Arabic letter, painted in red or black by the new authorities, the letter Nun, the first letter of a word for Christians. What the ultimatum followed, with a deadline in the 3rd week of July: convert, pay a special subjugation tax, leave with nothing, or die. They left, almost all of them, walking and driving toward Kurdish lines while fighters stripped them of money, jewelry, even wedding rings at the final checkpoints. A Christian presence that had endured in that city for well over 1,000 years, through empires, invasions, and the Mongols, was extinguished in a matter of weeks. The marked houses were confiscated and handed to loyalists, the churches converted, closed, or destroyed. In the first days of August, the same tide reached the Nineveh plains east of the city, the historic heartland of Iraq's Christians, and the defenses there gave way in a single night. From Karakash, the largest Christian town in the country, and from the villages around it, 100,000 people or more fled in the dark toward Kurdish territory, a whole ancient community on the road at once. They carried what a car could hold. Many have never returned, and in those very same days, the columns turned toward Sinjar. Sinjar, in the far northwest of Iraq near the Syrian border, was the heartland of the Yazidis, one of the oldest religious minorities in the Middle East. Their faith is neither Islam nor Christianity, but their own ancient tradition, and for centuries their neighbors had slandered them with a poisonous label, devil worshippers. To the ideologues of the Islamic State, that label made them something even Christians were not people of the book to be taxed, but pagans, to whom the old laws of conquest could be applied in full. The Kurdish forces assigned to protect Sinjar withdrew under attack in the early hours of the 3rd of August, 2014, and the Yazidi towns and villages were left naked before the advance. Some 200,000 people fled that morning. Around 50,000 of them, with nowhere else to run, climbed Mount Sinjar itself, the long bare ridge that rises out of the plain, carrying their children and almost nothing else. What happened in the villages below followed a pattern so consistent that investigators would later reconstruct it town by town. The men and older boys were separated from the women and children. They were driven to the edges of their own villages, to irrigation ditches and empty schoolyards, and they were shot. The women and girls were loaded onto trucks, registered, catalogued, and distributed or sold to fighters as property. A system of slavery run with paperwork, contracts, and price lists. I will not dress that in detail, because the detail belongs to the survivors and not to an evening's viewing. But I will not soften it either, because the organization itself did not. It published the rules of its slave system in its own magazines, proudly, as proof of religious authenticity. This was not a crime its leaders hid, it was a crime they advertised. On the mountain, tens of thousands of people were now trapped in August heat with no water, no shade, and no way down, ringed by the men who had just emptied their villages. Daytime temperatures on that bare rock run past 110 degrees Fahrenheit. The old and the very young began to die of thirst within days, and families later described choosing which child would drink. The world watched this unfold more or less live through the phones of the trapped, and for once the world moved. On the 7th of August, the American president went on television to announce that the United States would act, framing it explicitly as the prevention of a potential genocide, and naming the people on the mountain to a global audience that had for the most part never heard the word Yazidi in its life. American aircraft began dropping water and food onto the mountain, and on the 8th of August, American airstrikes, the first of what would become thousands, hit the ISIS positions around it. Kurdish fighters crossing from Syria fought open a corridor along the mountain's northern side, and over the following days, most of the trapped were brought down and walked into Syria and back around into Kurdish-held Iraq, a river of exhausted people crossing a war zone to escape a worse one. The rescue saved tens of thousands. It could not reach everyone, and one village in particular has come to stand for all the places it could not reach. Kocho, south of the mountain, was surrounded too quickly and too completely for its people to run. For nearly 2 weeks, its roughly 1,700 residents were held in place, negotiating, hoping, while the siege of the mountain played out on the horizon. On the 15th of August, the fighters gathered the village into its schoolhouse, separated the men and older boys from the women and children, and murdered the men in groups behind the building and in the fields. The women and girls were driven away into the slave markets. One of them was a young woman named Nadia Murad, who lost 6 brothers and her mother in a single day, who survived captivity in Mosul and escaped, and who would stand in Oslo 4 years later as a winner of the Nobel Peace Prize, telling the world exactly what had been done to her people. The full accounting, as far as one is possible, looks like this. A careful demographic study published 3 years later estimated that around 3,100 Yazidis were killed in those weeks, with a plausible range running from about 2,100 to 4,400, roughly half of them executed outright, the rest dying of thirst, hunger, and injury on the mountain. The same study estimated around 6,800 Yazidis were kidnapped. United Nations bodies, working earlier and with different methods, put the killed as high as 5,000 and the abducted at about 7,000. June of 2016, a United Nations Commission of Inquiry gave the crime its formal name, genocide. Not as a figure of speech, but as a legal finding, the deliberate attempt to destroy the Yazidis as a people, and the Commission stressed that the genocide was, at that moment, still ongoing, because thousands of the abducted were still in the organization's hands. Hold the image of that mountain in your mind as we go forward, because everything else this group did, the currencies and the courts and the propaganda films we are about to examine, was built on exactly this, and the world's memory has proven shorter than the survivors. It is tempting and comforting to imagine the Islamic State as pure chaos, a mob with guns. The reality was stranger and darker. What the millions of people inside its borders experienced was not anarchy. It was government, of a uniquely suffocating kind, and understanding that government is essential to understanding why it lasted as long as it did. There were ministries, called D1s, for health, for education, for agriculture, for natural resources. There were courts that settled land disputes and divorces alongside the ones that ordered amputations. Garbage was collected. Speed limits were enforced. More than one person who lived under the group would later tell reporters, with visible discomfort, that the streets had never been safer from ordinary crime, because the price of ordinary crime had become extraordinary. The money underneath this state was very real. At its peak, the group's income was estimated at somewhere between $1 and $3 million per day. Oil was the backbone, crude pumped from captured fields in eastern Syria and sold through smuggling networks, including, with grim irony, into territory held by its enemies, earning by many estimates $1 million a day or more on its own. The mechanics were almost mundane. At the wellheads, lines of civilian tanker trucks queued for days, independent traders buying crude at a discount and hauling it to backyard refineries and border markets, with the state taking its cut at the point of sale like any other commodity exchange. Nobody in the chain needed to believe anything. That was the genius of it, and the vulnerability, because a revenue stream made of trucks in open desert is a target list. But the deeper truth, the one that made the state so hard to strangle, was that its best customer was its own population. Everything was taxed: salaries, shops, harvests, electricity, water, telecommunications towers, trucks at checkpoints, cash withdrawals from the banks it now controlled. Analysts called it taxation. The people paying it, at gunpoint, with no vote and no appeal, might reasonably have called it the world's most organized extortion racket. The ledgers also show you who the state was actually for. Fighters were paid salaries, housed in confiscated homes, and served first at hospitals and bakeries, with foreign fighters often favored over local ones and local ones over everyone else. A captured payroll was a caste system written in accounting columns. Beneath the fighters stood the taxed, and beneath the taxed stood the enslaved, and every layer of the pyramid was documented, because this was a bureaucracy before it was anything else. Onto this economic machine was bolted the machinery of control. The religious police, the Hizbah, patrolled markets and streets, measuring beard lengths, inspecting dress, confiscating cigarettes, and punishing infractions on the spot. Public squares in Raqqa and Mosul became stages for punishment, beheadings, lashings, bodies displayed for days as civic instruction. Attendance at some executions was not merely permitted, but encouraged, and children stood in those crowds. The state performed its statehood with an almost obsessive attention to props. It issued identity documents and license plates, stamped its own passports that no country on earth would honor, and in late 2014 announced, with great ceremony, that it would mint its own currency in gold, silver, and copper to free the faithful from what it called the tyranny of the dollar. In practice, the dollar remained the currency that mattered, including to the leadership. But the theater was the point. Every stamp and coin another argument that this was not a gang, but a government. For women, the state was a cage built in stages. Dress rules tightened season by season until faces, hands, and eventually eyes disappeared behind cloth, enforced by fines, lashes, and punishments visited on husbands and fathers. In Raqqa, enforcement among women was handled partly by an all-female morality unit, the Khansa Brigade. Notorious among residents for its zeal, many of its members foreign volunteers policing Syrian women in a city they had joined from abroad. The schools tell you what the project really was. Curricula were rewritten from the ground up, music and philosophy abolished, history replaced, and mathematics textbooks reprinted with word problems counting weapons and ammunition. A generation of children inside the caliphate was being manufactured, deliberately, as the state's next cohort. The group called them the Cubs of the Caliphate, and it filmed their training too. Information itself was rationed like a commodity. Satellite dishes were banned and confiscated in sweep after sweep. Internet access was herded into supervised cafes, where the customers' screens faced the room, and being caught with the wrong footage on a phone could be a capital offense. A population of millions was being sealed, deliberately, inside the state's own broadcast, and that is why the smuggled footage of the citizen journalists cost so many of them their lives. They were not just reporting, they were breaking the state's monopoly on reality. Underneath all of it hummed a current that outsiders consistently underestimated because it sounded too strange to be policy. The movement was openly apocalyptic. Its glossy magazine was named for a small Syrian town, Dabiq, because of a prophecy that the armies of the end times would meet there, and its propaganda framed the war not as politics, but as the opening act of the world's final battle. Thousands of its recruits did not travel to join a country. They traveled to be present for the end of the world, and that is not an enemy that ordinary deterrence knows how to threaten. And that brings us to the machine that separated this organization from every terrorist group before it, the camera. The Islamic State ran what amounted to a state media conglomerate, with a central production arm, provincial film units, a glossy multilingual magazine, and a distribution strategy built natively for social media. Most of its output, and this is the part that tends to be forgotten, was not gore at all. It was advertising. Fighters handing out candy, markets full of vegetables, hospitals, beekeeping, sunsets over the Euphrates, an entire genre scholars came to call caliphate utopia content. The horror films were the sharp edge of the same campaign, calibrated for enemies. The utopia films were calibrated for recruits, and together they worked. They worked on a scale no group had ever achieved. By the most commonly cited estimates, roughly 40,000 foreign fighters and volunteers, drawn from at least 80 countries, traveled to Iraq and Syria to join the Islamic State and the war around it. Doctors, engineers, teenage girls, entire families with children, boarding flights to Turkey with one-way tickets, dissolving their old lives behind them. Each arrival fed the propaganda that recruited the next arrival. That is the loop that built the state of fear, and by late 2014 it seemed, to a frightened world, almost self-sustaining. But hold the utopia films up against the testimony of the people who actually lived there, and the state dissolves into what it was. Doctors described hospitals stripped of medicine, while fighters and their families went to the front of every line. Salaries existed, but so did a fine, a confiscation, or an informant for every corner of daily life, and the same neighbor who reported you might inherit your house. Residents of Raqqa who risked their lives to smuggle out footage showed the world the reality behind the sunsets, empty markets, terrified silences, and the bodies on the fences of the roundabouts. That was the caliphate at its noon, a protection racket wearing the costume of a civilization, so committed to the costume that it printed its own coins, and so dependent on the racket that it could not survive a day without it. If you have settled deep into the evening with me and these long, careful tellings have earned a place in your nights, this is the halfway mark, and the one moment I will point at the subscribe button, quietly and only once. It is how you tell me to keep lighting these particular corners of history. Now, back into the dark, because the machine we just described did not only devour people, it set out to devour the past itself. In February of 2015, a video appeared that historians and archaeologists around the world still speak of with something close to physical pain. Men with sledgehammers and power drills moved through the Mosul Museum, the second largest museum in Iraq, toppling statues from ancient Nineveh and Hatra and smashing them on the floor, working calmly, narrating their own righteousness to the camera. That same season, reports emerged from Mosul of a bonfire of books. The city's libraries, including collections centuries old, were purged, and thousands of volumes of history, poetry, and science went into the flames or the black market. The university's laboratories and archives were gutted. A city that had been a crossroads of learning since the Abbasids was having its memory surgically removed. The assault had begun earlier than the museum video, and it had begun with the city's holiest places. In July of 2014, within weeks of the takeover, the group packed explosives into the shrine of the prophet Jonah, a site sacred to Muslims and Christians alike, layered over an ancient Assyrian palace mound, and blew it into the sky in front of a filming crowd. Dozens of shrines, tombs, and mosques associated with saints and prophets followed, because in this creed, even the wrong kind of Islam was idolatry. Then the bulldozers drove out to the ruins themselves. In early 2015, the group filmed its men smashing and dynamiting Nimrud, one of the great royal cities of ancient Assyria, more than 3,000 years old, and released the footage with pride. The fortress city of Hatra, a World Heritage Site that had once turned back Roman legions, was attacked with rifles and sledgehammers on camera. Archaeologists spoke of losses that cannot be expressed in money because there was only ever one of each. Understand what this was, because the sledgehammer video was not a tantrum. It was policy, with two faces that contradicted each other perfectly. On camera, the group destroyed idols to prove its purity. Off camera, it ran a licensed, taxed industry of antiquities looting, issuing dig permits, and taking a cut of every artifact smuggled toward collectors in the West. a trade that expert testimony to the American Congress identified as one of its largest revenue streams after oil. They filmed the destruction of what they could not sell, and they sold what they did not film. Purity for the cameras, cash in the ledgers. Few details in this whole story tell you more honestly what the caliphate actually was. Then, in May of 2015, ISIS took Palmyra. If that name is unfamiliar, Palmyra was one of the most complete ancient cities on earth, a Roman-era caravan metropolis standing in the Syrian desert, its colonnades and temples largely intact after 2,000 years. It had survived Rome's fall, the Mongols, and every empire between. It did not survive this. Before the city fell, an 83-year-old man helped evacuate the contents of its museum. His name was Khalid al-Assad, and he had been Palmyra's head of antiquities for 40 years, a scholar so identified with the place that colleagues called him Mr. Palmyra. He stayed behind. The fighters took him, and for weeks they tortured him for the locations of the hidden treasures. He told them nothing. On the 18th of August, 2015, they murdered him publicly and displayed his body among the ruins he had spent his life protecting, with a placard listing his crimes, which amounted to loving old stones and the people who study them. Weeks later, the Temple of Belshamin was packed with explosives and leveled. Then the great Temple of Bel, then the tower tombs, then the triumphal arch. Satellite photographs told the world what had happened. One clean rectangle of rubble after another where 2,000 years had stood. And I will admit to you that of all the images this story contains, the ones that stay with me at strange hours are not only the atrocities against the living. It is an old man dying silent to protect statues in a century that likes to believe such choices belong to novels. The war on memory had one more front, and it was the cruelest, because it was aimed at the future. In the territories of the genocide, Yazidi shrines were systematically dynamited, dozens of them, the physical anchors of a faith that passes its tradition orally through place and pilgrimage. Destroy the shrine, the logic ran, and the grandchildren have nowhere to return to. The persecutors understood, precisely, that a people can survive its dead. It is harder to survive the erasure of everything the dead loved. Through the late summer and autumn of 2014, the world outside the caliphate came to know it through a series of staged murders, produced and released like episodes. The first in August was an American photojournalist named James Foley, who had been kidnapped in Syria almost 2 years earlier while documenting the suffering of Syrian civilians. He was beheaded on camera in the desert by a masked executioner with a London accent, and the video was engineered for maximum global circulation. It was framed explicitly as retaliation for the American airstrikes that had begun at Sinjar. Behind that video lay a hostage economy the public rarely saw whole. For 2 years, the group and its predecessors had been collecting Western journalists and aid workers, holding more than 20 of them at the peak, and quietly selling many of the Europeans back to their governments and employers for ransoms that, by respected estimates, ran into the tens of millions of dollars. The United States and Britain refused, as policy, to pay, which meant that by the summer of 2014, the Americans and Britons still in the cells had a different value, not as merchandise, but as material. Their jailers were a team of British-accented guards whose captives, in a piece of gallows humor that survived them, nicknamed the Beatles. Survivors of those cells described systematic torture. Years later, 2 of the group, stripped of their British citizenship, would be convicted in an American courtroom and sentenced to life, in proceedings that documented the fates of each hostage with terrible precision. It is one of the few corners of this entire story where something like formal justice has actually arrived. 2 weeks later, in early September, it was another American journalist, Stephen Sotloff, then a British aid worker, David Haynes, then a British taxi driver named Alan Henning, who had left his family at Christmas to drive relief convoys to Syrian children, and whose release even prominent jihadist voices had publicly pleaded for. In November, an American former soldier turned humanitarian, Peter Kassig, who had founded a medical charity for Syrian refugees and had converted to Islam in captivity. In January of 2015 came 2 Japanese hostages, Haruna Yukawa and the journalist Kenji Goto, who had gone to Syria trying to save him. That same winter, the group announced the death of Kayla Mueller, a 26-year-old American aid worker, seized in Aleppo, blaming a Jordanian airstrike for her death. American investigators concluded she had been held by the organization's inner circle and abused by Baghdadi himself before she died, and her name, as we will see, was not finished with this story. And then, in February, the campaign reached the piece of theater its authors clearly believed would break the coalition assembling against them. Unhurried, a Jordanian Air Force pilot, Muth al-Qasasebe, had been captured in December when his jet went down near Raqqa. He was 26 years old. The organization burned him alive in a cage, on camera, and released the footage inside a produced film, complete with effects and a soundtrack, in the first week of February 2015. Investigations concluded he had most likely been murdered a month before the video was even released, while the group was publicly pretending to negotiate his ransom. I give you these names, and I keep the descriptions this bare, for a reason. The organization designed each of these murders to be watched, dissected, and replayed, and every minute of horrified attention was, to them, a success. The names deserve remembering, the performances do not. And while the world's cameras fixed on the Western hostages, the same machinery was consuming local people at a scale no single video could hold. In Raqqa, a small circle of residents formed a clandestine group of citizen journalists to document what was being done to their city, publishing, under a name that was itself a protest, "Raqqa is being slaughtered silently." The organization hunted them with a dedication it usually reserved for armies, murdering their members inside Syria and assassinating 2 of them even across the border in Turkey. Some of them kept publishing anyway, and much of what the world knows about daily life under the caliphate exists because they refused to stop. What the performances actually achieved is worth recording, because it is the opposite of what their authors intended. The murder of the pilot did not break Jordan out of the coalition. It sent the country into a fury. The king ordered the execution of 2 convicted terrorists the group had demanded in trade, and Jordanian jets flew waves of retaliatory strikes within days. Public opinion across the Muslim world, already hostile, hardened further. The theater of cruelty was recruiting enemies faster than followers, and by the time that final film was released, the military tide it was meant to intimidate had already turned. On a hill in northern Syria that most of the world had never heard of 6 months before. The town is called Kobani, and it sits directly on the Turkish border, a modest Kurdish farming town of no obvious strategic weight. In September of 2014, the Islamic State decided to erase it, and threw at it the full weight of its captured arsenal, tanks, artillery, and waves of fighters, expecting the kind of collapse that had handed it Mosul. By early October, the group had taken hundreds of villages around the town, driving some 300,000 Kurds across the border into Turkey. The world's television cameras, standing safely on the Turkish side, could film the black flags going up on the hills over Kobani in real time. Nearly everyone, including senior Western officials, said openly that the town was about to fall. It did not fall. The Kurdish militias defending it, the YPG and its women's units, the YPJ, fought for it street by street, room by room, through the autumn and into the winter. And above them, something new had assembled. Through September of 2014, the United States had gathered a coalition that would eventually count dozens of nations and extended its air campaign from Iraq into Syria itself. In Kobani, that air power found exactly what a bombing campaign needs and rarely gets: a fixed battle where the enemy kept feeding fighters into a defined killing ground, in open country, far from the human shields of its cities. The Islamic State, whose method was momentum, terror, and movement, had chained itself to a siege it could not win and would not abandon, because its own propaganda had made the town a symbol. Coalition aircraft worked over its positions week after week. Airdrops of weapons and medical supplies reached the defenders, and Iraqi Kurdish reinforcements were eventually allowed to cross through Turkey with heavy weapons. On the 26th of January 2015, the last ISIS units were driven from the town. More than 1,000 of the group's fighters are estimated to have died there, spent against a place with no oil, no bank vaults, and no strategic prize beyond its own refusal. Much of Kobani was rubble, by some accounts 70% of it. But the myth died in that rubble, the myth of inevitability, the myth that the black flag only ever advanced. Muhammad from Kobani onward, the story of the caliphate on the map is a story of contraction. Tikrit fell back to Iraqi forces in the spring of 2015, and that autumn, Kurdish forces retook Sinjar, cutting the main highway that linked Mosul to Raqqa and opening the first of the mass graves to the daylight. The Kurdish-led forces in Syria, now armed with proof that the coalition's air power made them unbeatable in open battle, began rolling up the border, strangling the smuggling routes that had fed the state its recruits. There was one great counterpunch left in the caliphate. In May of 2015, it seized Ramadi, the capital of Iraq's largest province, and Palmyra in Syria in the same month, and for a season the newspapers wondered aloud whether the tide had turned at all. It had. Ramadi was retaken within the year, at the cost of a shattered city, and the pattern from then on never reversed again, only slowed. The money was bleeding out too. Coalition aircraft began systematically destroying the oil infrastructure, and in one strike after another, the trucks that carried the crude then went after the cash itself, bombing storage sites where the group kept its reserves in stacked bills. Salaries inside the caliphate were cut, then cut again. The state of fear was discovering that fear does not refine oil. In June of 2016, Fallujah, the first Iraqi city the group had taken, was retaken. In October, Iraqi and Kurdish forces began closing on Mosul itself, and in the same month, almost as a footnote, Turkish-backed forces took the town of Dabik, the place the magazine was named for, the appointed stage of the end of the world. The armies of the end times gave up prophecy's chosen battlefield after a short fight, and the flagship magazine named for it had already been quietly retired. Slowly, grindingly, the tide that had seemed supernatural in June of 2014 turned back into ordinary military arithmetic. And it was precisely then, as the state began to shrink, that the group turned its remaining strength outward, and the war arrived in the cities of Europe. On the evening of the 13th of November 2015, coordinated teams of gunmen and suicide bombers attacked Paris, the National Stadium, cafes and restaurants, and the Bataclan Concert Hall, where 90 people were murdered during a rock concert. 130 people died in Paris that night, the worst attack on French soil since the Second World War. The Islamic State claimed the operation the next day, and investigators traced its core to a network of French and Belgian members, several of whom had traveled to Syria and back. 4 months later, in March of 2016, the same Brussels-based network struck again, bombing the Brussels Airport departure hall and a metro train in the heart of the European quarter. 32 people were killed, more than 300 wounded. Before those attacks, a bomb smuggled aboard a Russian airliner leaving Egypt's Sinai had killed all 224 people on board, an operation claimed by the group's Egyptian branch. The message of this campaign was plain enough. If the caliphate could not hold its ground, it would export its war, and its propaganda now urged sympathizers who could not travel to kill where they stood, with trucks, with knives, with whatever was at hand. That call was answered, and the answers defined the fearful texture of those years. A truck driven through the crowds celebrating Bastille Day on the seafront of Nice in July of 2016 killed 86 people. Another truck was driven into a Berlin Christmas market that December. In May of 2017, a suicide bomber waited at the exits of a pop concert in Manchester, England, where the audience was full of young girls, and killed 22 people. Each attacker had sworn allegiance to the caliphate or acted in its name, and each needed nothing from it but the idea. The list of cities is longer than an evening can carry: Orlando, Istanbul, Barcelona, London, Sydney, and it fed a grim political cycle of fear across continents. Attacks hardened electorates, hardened borders, and hardened the wars, which produced the images of destruction that the propaganda then fed back to the next isolated young man at a screen. It was the group's last effective machine, and it ran on almost nothing. Brand was franchising in the other direction too. Militant groups across Africa and Asia pledged allegiance and were accepted as provinces of the caliphate, most notoriously Boko Haram in Nigeria, then the largest-scale killer of any of them. In Libya, the organization went further than a franchise and seized the coastal city of Sirte outright, holding it for the better part of 2 years as a fallback capital across the sea, until local forces backed by American airstrikes took it back at the end of 2016. The map of the core was shrinking, and the ideology was learning to live without it. But note carefully what the attacks could not do. They could not stop a single offensive. They could not hold a single town. Terror, which had built the state when it faced broken and demoralized enemies, turned out to be useless for keeping it against determined ones. By late 2016, the armies were closing in on the 2 cities where this story began its imperial phase, and we now follow them in. The battle for Mosul began in October of 2016, and it would run for 9 months, the largest urban battle the world had seen in generations. On one side stood Iraqi army divisions rebuilt from the humiliation of 2014, Kurdish forces, and the air power of the international coalition. On the other, thousands of fighters who had spent 2 years preparing the city for exactly this, with tunnel networks under the neighborhoods, bridges wired for demolition, and factories turning out car bombs on an industrial line. Between them stood more than 1 million civilians, and the Islamic State made its final policy toward the people it had claimed to govern brutally explicit: they were not to leave. Families who tried to flee were shot as an example, and the population was herded backward with the retreating fighters, street by street, as human cover. The state that had printed textbooks and collected garbage now openly operated on the principle that its citizens existed to slow enemy bullets. the defenders fought with an inventiveness that military academies still study with unease. Car bombs, armored in welded plate and driven by volunteers, were launched down the streets like guided missiles, hundreds of them over the course of the battle. Cheap commercial drones, the kind sold in any electronics shop, were rigged to drop grenades on troops and civilians alike, the first time any force had used them that way at scale. Investigators from the International Chemical Weapons Watchdog would separately confirm that the group had manufactured and used crude sulfur mustard, a chemical weapon, in earlier fighting, a threshold no armed group had crossed since the 1990s. East Mosul fell by January. West Mosul, with its dense old city where armor could not pass, became something close to annihilation. In June of 2017, with defeat certain, the fighters detonated explosives inside the great Al-Nuri Mosque, destroying the pulpit where Baghdadi had declared the caliphate and toppling the 800-year-old leaning minaret that had stood as the city's emblem, blowing up the birthplace of their own state rather than let it be liberated. Few gestures in modern war have summarized an ideology so completely. The final weeks in the old city compressed every cruelty of the war into a few hundred meters. Snipers shot at families who broke for the river. Food ran out, then water, and soldiers described civilians crawling out of the rubble who had been living on boiled cardboard and riverweed. When it was over, survivors emerged from basements into streets that no longer had shapes, carrying children who had learned not to make noise. Iraq's prime minister declared Mosul liberated in July of 2017. The price is still being counted. An Associated Press investigation, working from morgue lists and independent databases, concluded that between 9,000 and 11,000 civilians had died in the battle, roughly a third of them killed by the bombardments of the forces liberating them, a toll nearly 10 times what officials had acknowledged. Much of the western city was simply gone, and the battle did not entirely end when it ended. For years afterward, crews were still pulling bodies from the collapsed houses of the old city, and still finding the booby traps the defenders had threaded through the ruins, in door frames, in refrigerators, in children's toys. In this war, even the rubble was weaponized, and the demining of what was once one neighborhood of one city has consumed years of careful, dangerous work. Raqqa's turn came that same summer. The Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces fought into the caliphate's capital from June, and by mid-October 2017 the city where the black flags had first flown over a governing state was taken. Estimates of the destruction ran from 60 to 80% of the city damaged or destroyed. The squares where the executions had been staged were cratered and silent, and the population that returned did so to rubble seeded with mines. Here, too, honesty requires the uncomfortable ledger. Investigations by human rights researchers concluded that the coalition's own bombardment of Raqqa killed well over 1,000 civilians, trapped between the mines and snipers of the men holding them and the ordnance of the men freeing them. Liberation, in this war, was a word the liberated were usually too bereaved to use. It is possible to say the campaign was necessary and to say what it cost in the same breath, and a history that cannot hold both is propaganda in the other direction. What remained of the territorial caliphate was a shrinking corridor of towns along the Euphrates, and finally, by the winter of 2018 into 2019, a single village near the Iraqi border named Baghouz. Into that last pocket drained everything the state had left, its most committed fighters, its foreign families, its bureaucrats and gunsmiths and true believers, tens of thousands of people compressed into a tent city under siege. Those final weeks produced some of the strangest and most unsettling images of the entire war. Week after week, far beyond every estimate, people kept pouring out of that tiny pocket, tens of thousands of them in the end, gaunt fighters, wounded children, and long lines of women in black walking out to surrender, many entirely unrepentant, praising the caliphate to the cameras with children on their hips. The screening points sorted them into prisons and camps, and the camps, as we will see, became the war's next unsolved problem. The fighters held on among the tents and wrecked vehicles until there was nothing left to hold. And on the 23rd of March, 2019, the Syrian Democratic Forces raised their flags over Baghouz and declared the territorial caliphate finished. 4 years and 9 months had passed since the sermon in Mosul. The state that had ruled 8 million people now ruled a burned field of tents. But 2 loose ends remained, and neither of them was the kind that simply fades. One was a man, the other was everything and everyone the war left behind. The man was found in October of 2019, in the last place anyone was supposed to look for him, the province of Idlib in Syria's northwest, territory dominated by rival jihadists who despised him, a few miles from the Turkish border, in a compound outside a village called Barisha. On the night of the 26th of October, American helicopters crossed hundreds of miles of hostile airspace and put Special Operations Forces onto that compound. The operation had been given a name chosen with intent, Operation Kayla Mueller, after a 26-year-old American aid worker who had been held, abused, and killed in the group's custody. Cornered in a dead-end tunnel under the compound as the assault closed in, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi detonated a suicide vest, killing himself and 2 children he had dragged into the tunnel with him. The quiet scholar from Camp Bucca, the self-proclaimed successor to the prophets, ended his caliphate underground, in the dark, using children as his final shield. His organization confirmed his death within days, named a successor almost nobody had heard of, and continued. That successor died in another American raid a little over 2 years later, also by his own explosives, also taking family members with him, and the leaders after him have lived and died namelessly, announced and erased like passwords. The organization's men remain a physical presence too, and not only in the desert. Kurdish-run prisons across northeastern Syria hold thousands of captured fighters from the final battles, a population their guards describe as an army in storage. In January of 2022, fighters blew a hole in the wall of the largest of those prisons, at Hasaka, and assaulted it from the outside while the inmates rose from within, and it took some 10 days of fighting, with American and British support, to put the uprising down. The war did not end at Baghouz. It changed its unit of measurement. That is the first thing to understand about the ashes. The territorial state is gone, but the organization that built it was born from a defeat in the camps and prisons of an earlier war, and it has treated every defeat since as an intermission. Its cells still kill in Iraq and Syria, and its affiliates carry its flag across parts of Africa and Asia. Nor did the treasury die at Baghouz. Investigators tracking the group's finances have warned for years that a war chest survived the caliphate, buried in the literal sense, cached in the desert, and buried in the financial sense, laundered into legitimate businesses across the region through frontmen and money exchanges. The state was a phase. The firm, in the coldest sense of the word, is still trading. The branch in Afghanistan has proven the deadliest air. In August of 2021, in the chaos of the American withdrawal, one of its suicide bombers attacked the crowds at the gates of Kabul airport, killing around 170 Afghan civilians and 13 American service members. In March of 2024, gunmen claimed by the organization stormed a packed concert hall outside Moscow and killed more than 140 people. The caliphate is dead. The idea has a passport for every border. The second thing to understand is measured in people. In the northeast of Syria, the detention camps that received the human remnant of Baghouz, the largest of them called al-Hol, swelled at their peak to tens of thousands of women and children from dozens of countries, in conditions that aid organizations have described as both a humanitarian disaster and an incubator for the next generation of the ideology. Home countries, for years, largely refused to take their citizens back. Children have grown toward adulthood inside those fences, citizens of nowhere, raised among the most radicalized survivors of the war, while murders inside the camp kept its ideology enforced behind the wire. Justice, meanwhile, has arrived only in fragments. Iraqi courts have tried thousands of members in proceedings human rights observers found swift and often shallow, and a United Nations team spent years assembling evidence of the genocide before its mandate ended with almost no international trials to show for it. A German court delivered the world's first conviction for genocide against a member of the group, a man who had bought a Yazidi woman and her 5-year-old daughter and let the child die of thirst. One conviction for a genocide is a start that shames the arithmetic. And the third thing is measured in absence. The Yazidi community counts thousands of its people still missing more than a decade after the genocide began, women and children who vanished into the slave system and never came out. Some have been found over the years, in camps, in households, in other countries, grown children who no longer remember their language. Each recovery makes the news in Iraq, one name at a time, which tells you how rare each one is. Mass graves around Sinjar are still being opened, and identifications still arrive family by family, year by year, matched from the bones and the scraps of clothing mothers described from memory. On the order of 200,000 Yazidis have never been able to return home, and many of the survivors live to this day in displacement camps within sight of their mountain. The genocide, the United Nations investigators said, was ongoing. For the families still waiting, it has never actually stopped. And yet, if you want a reason not to end this evening in despair, go looking for pictures of Mosul today. The city rebuilds, unevenly and underfunded, but it rebuilds. Students returned to the burned university and formed human chains to restock the library with donated books. Musicians played in the streets within weeks of liberation, precisely because it had been forbidden, and the first concerts happened in buildings that still smelled of smoke. The Al-Nouri Mosque and its leaning minaret have been raised again from their rubble, stone by stone, in an international restoration effort that spent years sifting the original bricks from the debris. Palmyra stands half-broken in the desert, awaiting a peace stable enough to permit repair. The museums catalog what was recovered and mourn what surfaced in auction houses, or never surfaced at all. So what was it, in the final accounting, this thing that called itself a state? Strip away the theology at war, and you find the oldest machinery there is, the machinery of conquest, slavery, and extraction, updated with oil revenue and a media department. Its single genuine innovation was the camera, the discovery that in a connected world, atrocity itself could be made into a broadcast, a recruiting tool, and a currency. But its deepest weakness was the same as its weapon. A state built on fear could not survive the moment its enemies stopped being afraid, and its subjects, the millions who buried its victims, proved to have longer memories than its propagandists. The caliphate promised its followers the end of history. History, patient as always, declined. We began tonight with a bulldozer breaking a border, and we end with a minaret being rebuilt. And between those two images lies everything a civilization has to know about this chapter, and everything it seems determined to forget. Here is what I would ask of you before you sleep, and I ask it because this history is different from most of the ones we walk through together. This one happened in the age of the smartphone, in your lifetime, on your screens. So tell me in the comments what you remember of that summer of 2014, where you were when this story first reached you, what you believed it meant. And if you were too young to remember it at all, say that honestly, because nothing would better prove why evenings like this one are worth spending. The names in this story that deserve carrying were never the ones on the black flags. They belong to the cadets on the riverbank, the families on the mountain, the old scholar among his ruins, the pilot, the aid workers, the journalists who walked toward this story so the rest of us could know it. I'm Arthur. Carry one of those names with you into tomorrow, and let the men who craved your fear have none of it. Sleep well wherever this finds you. And when you are ready for another hour of the history the daylight skips, I will be here.